Bobby Fischer was absolutely devastating in his experience at the United States Championships. In this game, he faces Pal Benko in the 1963 event. Benko chooses to start the game with the modern defense. By fianchettoing the bishop at g7 without committing any central pawns, black maintains some flexibility. At the same time, white is allowed to completely dominate the center. This is one of the hypermodern openings. These sorts of openings weren't well respected before about 1925, but in the late 20s and then throughout the rest of the 20th century, they grew in popularity, and in fact, even Bobby Fischer plays hypermodern defenses as black, though he doesn't like this particular defense. Fischer chooses to keep the game in the king-pawn group by resisting the temptation to play c4. That would create a very big center, but would also allow black to switch to Fischer's own favorite defense, the King's Indian defense, by bringing his knight out to f6. Now we are in the Pirtz defense, or we will be when the knight actually reaches f6. However, it is almost certain that black is going to bring the knight to f6 in this line. Fischer responds with the Austrian attack. The f-pawn can be used as a battering ram at f5, leading to open lines for white's dark square bishop and possibly a rook at f1, especially if white castles on the king side, as we expect. After knight f6, we are formally in the Pirtz defense, and white obviously is going to bring a knight to f3, and black equally obviously is going to castle. Now Bobby has to decide what to do with his light square bishop, and he chooses to put it at d3, where it supports the pawn at e4. This is the normal continuation. At this point, black usually chooses to bring out the knight from b8. It usually goes to c6, sometimes it'll go to a6. There's also a sort of Sicilian approach where black brings the pawn to c5, but Benko chooses to develop the bishop to g4. Now, this is a perfectly reasonable plan in theory, because by getting out, the bishop opens up the possibility of bringing the knight to d7, as the bishop won't be trapped in at c8. So the move is perfectly reasonable, perfectly logical, but as it turns out, it's actually an error, because white's going to be able to force matters on the king's side. h3 challenges the bishop right away, and after the exchange, the knight comes out to c6, but already white has the advantage of the bishop pair. White has two bishops, black has one. Black has an extra knight, but if the position opens up, then the bishops will be much more effective. By putting the bishop at e3, the pawn at d4 is defended, which was necessary, and Benko strikes in the center immediately. The idea is to hope to open up a line on the e-file so that pressure can be put on e4, and of course there is more immediate pressure on d4. This move is not only logical, but it's probably absolutely necessary, because otherwise the white pawn might get to e5 and cause a lot of trouble. Fischer opens up the d-file for future use and eliminates the threat that the pawn faced when it was still at d4. Benko captures back, and Fischer uses the battering ram. He advances into enemy territory by sending a single soldier, but the g-pawn may soon join its comrade. Black's problem is a lack of targets. There's simply no counterplay. So it's clear that black's opening strategy has already failed. this is a very risky capture, because a pawn, which was an important defender of the king, is now gone from g6. Instead, Benko probably should have brought the knight to d4, at least attacking white's queen and gaining a small initiative. Now, there's a big problem with the light squares. Benko figured that it might be better to use the knight this way, coming to d4 with a simultaneous attack on the queen and also pressure at c2. Of course, there's a pawn at e5 just sitting there. Now, Bobby didn't take the pawn. Let's see why not. After queen takes e5, there's a shocking move, knight g4. Now, it's true the knight is attacked by the pawn, but the problem is that white's queen at e5 is attacked by the bishop at g7. So, there'd be nothing better than queen takes g7 check, king takes g7, and then taking the knight. But after knight c6, it's not clear how white should make progress. It's two bishops and a pawn isn't worth quite enough for the queen. And it's true you can pick up another exchange with bishop h6 and then take the rook. But even after castling, white has a rook, a bishop, a pawn for the queen. But white's pawns are kind of weak. e4, g4, g2. The bishop is just sitting at d3 doing nothing. And after knight e5, black would have a very strong blockade and a clear advantage. So after knight d4, Bobby simply retreated the queen to f2. This is the correct plan. Now, Benko decided to retreat the knight to e8 so that the bishop at g7 has a little bit of defense and that the rook on f8 is lined up a little bit more easily against the queen at f2. The idea is that perhaps at some point f5 might become playable, and then the opposition of the rook and the queen would become important. Fischer chooses king safety over a kingside pawn storm. Of course, he could have castled on the other side of the board and just thrown the pawns up the board. Fischer was under a little pressure because even though he was already going to win the tournament, he was trying to do something unbelievable. He's trying to rack up a perfect score of 11-0. And so he had nothing to fear from a loss or a draw. He was going to win the tournament and become champion, but he's aiming for a little bit of chess immortality here. To do that, he decides to play somewhat conservatively. Now, this is an interesting position for the knight. It does control important squares, or at least contests important light squares. At f5, at c4, even maybe b5 is important. A little more pressure on the pawn at e4. But this was not the plan that Fischer was expecting. He was expecting to see the pawn move to c6, followed by an exchange of knights. And then the bishop pair would be fine, enough to probably lead to a winning game. But after knight d6, the game takes an aggressive turn. The queen comes to g3, setting up the big pin on the bishop at g7. And Benko has a choice here. He can move the king to safety at h8. That's what he decides to do in the game. But he could have played more aggressively. Suppose he does try to open things up. Then the bishop comes to h6, exploiting the pin. Queen comes up to defend. There are a bunch of exchanges. And the position is very difficult for black because the pawn at e5 and the pawn at h7 are weak. The bishop is better than the knight. I think that Benko, who is one of the great endgame specialists in the world, he wasn't about to suffer the kind of torture he would have experienced as black in this position. So instead, after queen g3, he moved the king to h8. One of the problems with being a very good endgame player is that you may want to avoid endgames which are difficult, possibly drawable, but very difficult, because you know how easy it is to play the other side of the position, and you know that one small mistake could lead to a disaster in the defense. So I think his caution is well justified here.